Good morning, 10 a.m. on the West Coast, 1 o'clock out east. It's this week's time for Tech Take. Of course, if you haven't seen us before, we talk everything technology and how it relates to news in your life. We're very layman, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to bring them into us, any kind of depth that you want in regarding to our topics. You can hit us on Facebook, of course, on Twitter, right here on the chat on FoxNewsLive.com. And the link, of course, you know it, is live.foxnews.com. We have some great guests today. We have Allison Berry talking about some outstanding technology for our military. We have another guest from New York we're going to go to in a second. We also have a guest here live in studio. And then at the end of our show, we have some of our gadgets we'll be able to show you and highlight. And in fact, there's a couple that are going to stand out that you have not seen before, I guarantee. And they're not going to break your pocketbook, as well as one that's being released just today. And you'll be the first person in the world to see it live here on Tech Take Live. All right, so with that, we're going to go right to New York with our first guest. Eric Yaverbaum is joining us, and he's here, the associate publisher of Social Media Mags, and you can find him at Really Yaverbaum. Also, he has his own PR website, which will show up in a moment. Eric, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Always great to be here.
You know, I know we're going to talk about the news flow on social media, and there may be no better time to talk about that than the last week. We had, of course, the blast in Texas that killed a number of our first responders and people that were nearby. But, of course, we had the two bombings that took place in Boston last week, and so much of social media took part in that, some to the detriment, unfortunately, of the story, but a lot of it to the advancement of the story and to help identify the suspects. Let's talk about that first. Let's talk about the news flow on social media.
Well, here's the thing about the news flow. If you think back, and this is when I realized that there was going to be a marriage of social media and real news, of journalists who were there, who aren't real journalists, and real journalists. You know, people that write for the New York Times and people who are bloggers. When Captain Sully landed that plane in the Hudson, and the very first photo of all the people on the wing came from Twitter, long before it was on any network, I said, social media is now going to play a role in the way that information is disseminated and in the news flow. I think that it's kind of the wild, wild west in the news now, and we're going to have to figure out how to get accurate information, because there's an awful lot of misinformation that's spread in everybody's rush to get the information out fast as they possibly can.
I want to remind viewers, too, you can weigh in on Twitter, on Facebook, right here on our chat live. I'm monitoring them all, and so are our folks in New York. So feel free to ask any questions of Eric or I, or anything for that matter. You mentioned about some of the flow and how it's really relating with social media. I guess one of my questions is, how are these stories being told? Because, you know, obviously you have people that are going to have their own, well, whether it be political or own agenda of any type for that matter. You have people that really are trying to tell stories that maybe don't have a background in that, but then you have people that are very good at what they do. So how are these stories being told when using social media?
Well, I mean, when using social media, by the way, in Boston, the very first photo, which was on Twitter with it in under 60 seconds, that's the first place we got a visual of what was going on there, on Twitter, which immediately feeds into broadcast. You know, you have 24/7, many of them, just like here, networks who are covering things all day long. They look at social media. They look at Facebook, they look at Twitter, they look at a variety of places to see, what information they can get. But sometimes they also report based on things that they read. I mean, there was a poor kid at Brown University whose name came out in Boston who has absolutely nothing to do with anything, who can't leave his room now. Because a lot of people reported it, and a lot of people have since, apologized for reporting it, but they did. And this doesn't happen just because of social media. I mean, it's always happened in the news anyway. I mean, the news happens so quickly. What I would suggest to people is that, I mean, I'm a news junkie. In my office, I have 12 different screens open. I watch everything on the internet and on, in the real world, television. What I would suggest to people is, when there's a big, bad breaking event, turn off your TV, turn off your smartphone, turn off your Twitter feed, take a walk, read the news the next day, and you'll have as accurate of a reflection on what happened the day before as your friends who are glued to 24/7 news cycles.
Of course, I'm going to disagree with you there. I'm going to say turn it on and monitor and understand, who to follow, who not to follow, and at the same time, do some research. If you see somebody report something, go on and look. Is anybody else reputable going with that? And if not, keep it on the sidebar, and maybe something that maybe coming down the pipeline that eventually does happen. You mentioned some of the pictures that were posted that weren't even the right people. I mean, one of them ended up on the front page of the New York Post. I mean, that happened. You had CNN misreport stuff, and a lot of it does come from social media, and of course that then just snowballed. Before I ask you my next question, I do want to give a couple of shout-outs. As you know, this is an online show, so we have a lot of people watching from all over. We had people from Asia last week that we were talking about today. Shondell Taylor is watching from Trinidad and Tobago. And we have Ron Rigdon, Alexis Rivera-Says. She's from Jersey City, so back here close to home watching as well. So we appreciate them tuning in. A lot of misinformation, Eric. That's the other issue that, as you mentioned, maybe check it out the next day. And I say, no, watch those feeds right now. But be careful of misinformation and understand that people are going to throw things out there that aren't true. So that's why you have to do your research and know who you're following.
Yeah, you know, the problem is, look, I'm a news junkie. I'm not going to take my own advice. I'm going to be glued to, you know, a dozen different news sources. And they will tell me different things. When a reputable news station reports something, you know, for me, I look at that and say, I take it with a grain of salt until it's confirmed. You know, I was up in Newtown. I sat on a desk for a network for a day, and I saw the way the police handled the information there. And the police lieutenant who held press conferences every other hour and then every other day said basically, look, if it doesn't come from me, it's not a fact. You're asking me a lot of questions about a lot of misinformation. We will tell you what we factually know, and that's all we will say. You know, that's somebody you can trust, and that's a source you can trust. Other than that, I think there's a lot of rumors that fly around, and a lot of people who believe those rumors. And if you looked at the number of retweets, for instance, in Boston, the amount of things that were retweeted that was misinformation was staggering.
Completely, and that's not just Boston. In a lot of, especially political stories during the election season, it was a mess. We talked about it here on Fox News Live about how people were just tuning out because there was so much stuff being printed online, whether it be on your Facebook or Twitter or whatever you happen to be watching, Pinterest. There was a lot of misinformation. People, of course, had political agendas. You know, and the other thing, actually, a point that I want to bring up for our last question here, Laura Moran is watching us, and she says, you know, I read this. I put on a tweet at one point saying we're live about the show, and she put, I read this as we are alive, and I thought, well, that's good. I guess the point is there that even when you have Twitter and you have such a small little line, there's a lot of times you'll look and you'll read it, and because it's just a quick blurb, basically, you might misconstrue what's been typed, whether it be content or whether it be just direction.
Well, you know what? As easily as anybody could misconstrue what you or I are saying right now, and somebody out there probably is, when you have such a small number of characters and you can tell, you know, have a perspective so briefly, there's a lot of room for error in that.
All right, Eric Yaverbaum from New York. You can follow him on Really Yaverbaum. It's 1L, R-E-A-L-Y, Yaverbaum. It's on Twitter, of course. The associate publisher of Social Media Mags. Appreciate you coming on. Great information. And just reminding people that even if you aren't a news junkie, it's okay to follow those feeds, but make sure before you hit the retweet button, you do a little bit of research and understand whether it's breaking news or whether it's political or whatever it is. Just make sure that you might ensure that it's something that's true before you just automatically assume that somebody's saying something that is true. That's for sure. Eric, thanks for joining us from New York.
Thank you so much for having me.